He was a titan of Wall Street, a man who could make or break fortunes with a single word. She was his pregnant wife, the perfect, beautiful accessory to his multi-million-dollar life. But in the glittering heart of New York high society, surrounded by their so-called friends, Ryan Cole decided to offer a different kind of toast. One that wouldn't celebrate their coming child, but would instead douse his wife Ava in shame. He thought his public mockery was the final word, a cruel display of his power. He had no idea it was just the opening salvo in a war she was already prepared to win. The air in the penthouse was worth more than most people's homes. It was a carefully filtered, climate-controlled atmosphere, smelling faintly of white roses and old money. From 68 floors above Central Park, the city lights sprawled out like a blanket of scattered diamonds, a kingdom over which Ryan Cole presided. Tonight, however, the view offered Ava no comfort. It felt less like a kingdom and more like an exquisitely furnished prison. Ava Cole ran a hand over the gentle, firm swell of her stomach. 7 months. 7 months, carrying the heir to the Cole empire, a dynasty built on ruthless acquisitions and Ryan's almost terrifying intuition for the market's whims. Her own intuition was screaming now, a silent, frantic alarm that had been ringing for months. She watched her husband across the marble expanse of their living room. Dressed in a bespoke Tom Ford suit, Ryan was a portrait of masculine perfection. Dark hair, a jawline that could cut glass and eyes the color of a stormy sea. He was talking on the phone, one hand gesturing dismissively as he paced. He hadn't really looked at her all day. Not a real look, anyway. He had glanced in her direction, his eyes scanning her form-fitting maternity gown from a piece, a part with an unreadable expression. It wasn't the adoring gaze of a husband, excited to be a father. It was the critical once-over of an art collector, assessing whether a piece still belonged in his collection. No Marcus, that's unacceptable. He snapped into his phone. Liquidate the position. All of it. I don't care if it triggers a slide. Let it slide. We'll buy it back at the bottom. That's an order. He ended the call without a goodbye, the silence that followed feeling heavier than the noise. He finally turned to Ava, his focus sharp and unsettling. Is the car ready? He asked. His voice was clipped, devoid of warmth. It's been waiting downstairs for 10 minutes. Ryan. Ava replied, her own voice soft, but with a tensile strength he always seemed to miss. She had learned to be a still lake, reflecting his moods, while her own currents ran deep and hidden. Good. He adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, a nervous tic he had when he was either about to close a massive deal or lie. He was an excellent liar. You know how important tonight is. The Van Houtens are legacy money. They need to see stability. Unity. Ava's heart gave a painful thud. Unity. The word was a bitter joke. Unity was the two of them attending charity galas, their hands linked for the cameras, while his other hand was texting someone else under the table. Unity was her overseeing the renovations on the nursery, while he was working late, the scent of a strange, expensive perfume clinging to his coat when he finally came home. The perfume wasn't hers. She wore Joe Malone's peony and blush suede. This other scent was something sharper, more aggressive, something like Tom Ford's Black Orchid. I know, she said, forcing a small smile. I'll be on my best behavior. A flicker of something annoyance, relief crossed his face. He preferred her this way, compliant, beautiful, and silent. He walked over, placing a hand on her pregnant belly. The gesture was meant to look tender, a performance for an unseen audience, but his touch was cold proprietary. It felt like he was claiming ownership of the baby, not connecting with it. "This is what they want to see," he murmured, his gaze distant already at the restaurant, already charming investors. The happy family. The continuation of the line. Ava didn't flinch. She had spent the last 5 years of their marriage mastering the art of stillness. She'd grown up in a comfortable upper-middle-class family in Connecticut, her father a respected architect, her mother a history professor. Her world was one of loving stability and intellectual curiosity. Marrying Ryan had been like being catapulted into another dimension, a world of dazzling wealth, private jets, and treacherous social currents. She had been in love truly and deeply with the charming, ambitious man who had pursued her relentlessly. But the man she had married had slowly been replaced by this cold, calculating stranger who valued stock prices over feelings and public image over private reality. "The car," she said, gently removing his hand from her belly. "We shouldn't be late." He nodded, already turning away, his mind back on the deal. As she picked up her small silver Bottega Veneta clutch, she caught her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows. A woman in a beautiful gown, a precious life growing inside her, standing in a palace of glass and steel, looking utterly, desperately alone. But her eyes held a secret. It wasn't despair in their depths. It was determination. Ryan thought he was the master of this universe, the one who gave the orders. He believed she was just another beautiful asset. He had no idea that this asset was about to mature and the returns would be devastating. The restaurant Ethelgard was the kind of place that didn't have a sign. If you didn't know where it was, you weren't supposed to be there. The interior was a symphony of hushed tones, dark wood, and pools of golden light that made everyone look like they were in a Rembrandt painting. The air hummed with the low murmur of powerful people making powerful deals. Their table was the best in the house, a secluded circular booth overlooking the restaurant's private garden. They were joined by Richard and Amelia Van Houten, an older couple with money so old it was practically fossilized, and a younger woman whom Ryan introduced with a little too much casualness. "And this is Isabella Thorne," he said, his hand hovering near the small of her back for a fraction of a second too long. "Isabella is a brilliant art consultant who's about to open her own gallery in Chelsea. She's been advising me on some new acquisitions." Isabella was stunning in a severe, angular way that was the polar opposite of Ava's softer beauty. She wore a black, backless dress that clung to her slender frame. Her dark hair was pulled into a sleek, tight ponytail, and her red lipstick was a slash of defiance. She smiled, but it didn't reach her cold, assessing eyes. And on the air around her, faint but unmistakable, was the sharp, spicy scent of black orchid. Ava's blood ran cold, but her expression remained serene. She extended a hand. "A pleasure to meet you, Isabella. Your gallery sounds exciting." "Ava, darling." Isabella said, her voice smooth as silk, but with an undertone of condescension. She barely touched Ava's fingers. "Ryan has told me so much about you." Her eyes flickered down to Ava's belly, and a tiny knowing smirk played on her lips. The dinner began a carefully choreographed dance of conversation. Richard Van Houten pontificated about the Fed's interest rate policy, while his wife Amelia discussed her latest charity auction. Ryan was in his element, charming, witty, and razor-sharp. He refilled Amelia's wine glass, complimented Richard on a recent business victory, and expertly steered the conversation towards the synergies between their family offices. Ava played her part. She smiled, nodded, and asked polite questions about the Van Houten's grandchildren. but she was acutely aware of the drama unfolding across the table. She saw the way Ryan's knee would occasionally brush against Isabella's under the table. She saw the shared glances, the tiny, almost imperceptible smiles they exchanged when they thought no one was looking. It was a brazen, insulting performance. The first public jab came during the appetizer course. Amelia, a kind woman at heart, turned to Ava. "You must be so thrilled, my dear. A baby is such a blessing. Are you hoping for a boy or a girl?" Before Ava could answer, Ryan laughed a short, sharp sound that was anything but joyful. "Oh, we're just hoping it inherits its father's brains. God knows it's a genetic lottery." A brief, awkward silence fell over the table. Richard cleared his throat. Amelia's smile faltered. Ava felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her composure. "Well, I was a double major in economics and art history at Columbia," she said lightly, her voice steady. "So I think our child has a decent chance either way." Isabella let out a small, tinkling laugh. "Art history. How sweet. It's so wonderful to have a hobby, isn't it?" The insult was clear. "You're a dilettante. I'm the professional." Ava looked directly at Isabella, a calm, cool gaze that seemed to surprise the other woman. "It's more than a hobby. Understanding the history of an asset class is crucial to understanding its value." "I'm sure you'd agree." Isabella's smile tightened. Ryan, sensing he was losing control of the narrative, decided to double down. The main courses arrived, a stunning display of culinary art. As the waiter placed a plate of pan-seared scallops in front of Ava, Ryan held up a hand. "Whoa there. Are you sure she should be eating that?" he said, his voice loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "With the way her ankles have been swelling up, I think we should be swapping that for a plate of steamed vegetables. We don't want her retaining any more water. It's a delicate situation." He gestured towards her belly. "We're trying to manage the expansion." The table fell silent again, but this time it was a thick, horrified silence. Amelia Van Houten looked at Ryan as if he'd just grown a second head. Richard stared down at his plate. It was a moment of breathtaking cruelty. He wasn't just mocking her. He was trying to infantilize her, to portray her as a fragile, hormonal vessel whose only function was to breed. Isabella, however, was enjoying the show. She took a delicate sip of her wine, her eyes gleaming with triumph over the rim of the glass. She was watching Ava, waiting for the tears, for the scene, for the dramatic exit that would prove her to be the unstable, emotional wife. Ava looked at Ryan. She looked at the smug, predatory face of his mistress. She felt the eyes of the Van Houtens on her, filled with pity. She felt the weight of the gazes from the surrounding tables. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot, suffocating blanket. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, and for a second she thought she might actually be sick. But then she thought of the child inside her. Her child. Not his. Hers. A wave of pure, cold fury washed through her, clearing her head and strengthening her spine. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. She placed her napkin deliberately on the table. She pushed her chair back, the movement slow and graceful. She stood up, a queen rising from a council of fools. She looked directly at Ryan, her voice not a whisper, but a clear, calm statement that cut through the restaurant's murmur. "You're right, Ryan," she said, her tone even. "It is a delicate situation. More delicate than you can possibly imagine." She then turned her gaze to Isabella, holding it for a long, chilling moment. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The look on her face was a promise. Finally, she addressed the stunned Van Houtens. "Amelia, Richard, it was a pleasure to see you both. I hope you have a lovely evening." Without another glance at her husband, Ava Cole turned and walked out of the restaurant. Her steps were unhurried, her back was ramrod straight. She didn't look like a woman fleeing in shame. She looked like a woman on her way to war. The diners she passed parted for her as if by instinct. In the hushed, opulent dining room of Ethelgard, every single person knew they had just witnessed not an ending, but a beginning, and it was not going to be pretty. The taxi ride back to the penthouse was a blur of streaking lights and muffled city sounds. Ava didn't cry. The time for tears had passed months ago, late one Tuesday night, when she had finally found what she was looking for. She had long suspected Ryan's infidelity. It was in the clichés, the late nights, the sudden, secretive business trips the phone that was always angled away from her. But it was his arrogance that had been his undoing. He believed she was intellectually beneath him, a beautiful ornament he'd acquired incapable of understanding the complex world he inhabited. He'd made her a signatory on the Cole family trust, a gesture he thought demonstrated his faith in her, but which he saw as a mere formality. He assumed she never looked at the statements. He was wrong. Her father, the architect, had taught her that the devil is always in the details in the blueprints. Her mother, the history professor, had taught her that history is a series of patterns, and her own education in economics had taught her how to read a balance sheet. The affair wasn't revealed by a lipstick stain, but by a wire transfer. $350,000 moved from the trust's auxiliary account to a newly formed LLC, an LLC named Thorn Galleries. It was a sloppy, arrogant mistake. He hadn't even bothered to hide it, well confident his wife wouldn't know where to look or what she was seeing. That night, sitting in the cold silence of their home office, the city lights indifferent to her discovery, Ava had wept. She cried for the man she had loved, for the marriage she had believed in, for the future that had just been stolen from her. The grief was a physical blow, leaving her breathless. But as the sun began to rise, casting long shadows across the expensive carpets, the grief began to curdle into something else, something harder, colder, and infinitely more powerful resolve. She wasn't just a wife. She was about to be a mother. Her child would not be raised in a house built on lies. Her child's legacy would not be controlled by a faithless, cruel man and his vapid mistress. She was not the victim in this story. She was the consequence. The first call she made was not to a divorce lawyer. It was to Cassandra Cassie Reyes, her best friend from Columbia. They had been inseparable in college, 2 scholarships, kids navigating a world of privilege. While Ava had pursued art and married into that world, Cassie had gone to Yale Law and had become one of the most feared forensic accountants and commercial litigators in New York. She was a shark who smiled like a dolphin, and she had a particular distaste for arrogant men who underestimated smart women. Ava Cassie's voice had been warm, but instantly sharpened when she heard Ava's tone. "What's wrong?" Ava told her everything. She didn't cry this time. She laid out the facts, the dates, the wire transfers, the suspicions with the cool precision of a CEO briefing her board. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Cassie said, "Okay. The first thing you do is nothing. You say nothing. You act normal. You are the perfect, loving, slightly naive wife. Let him get comfortable. Let him get arrogant. Let him keep making mistakes. In the meantime, I'm going to start digging. We're not just going to divorce him, Ava. We are going to dismantle him." For the next 4 months, Ava lived a double life. By day, she was the placid, pregnant Mrs. Cole selecting swatches for the nursery attending prenatal yoga and smiling serenely at Ryan's society functions. But by night, after he was asleep, she was Cassie's lead operative. She scanned documents, forwarded suspicious emails from their shared accounts, and meticulously noted every expensive gift, every business trip, every financial inconsistency. She created a shadow ledger, a detailed accounting of Ryan's deceptions. Cassie, in turn, was building a fortress. She'd discovered that the Thorn Galleries LLC was just the beginning. Ryan had been systematically siphoning marital assets for years, hiding them in a web of offshore accounts and shell corporations, all in violation of the prenuptial agreement he himself had forced Ava to sign. The prenup was ironclad in its definition of marital property. Property he was now illegally diverting. He was trying to build a separate empire for himself and his mistress, funded by the wealth he and Ava had accumulated together. The dinner at Ethelgard wasn't the catalyst. It was the curtain rising on a play that Ava and Cassie had been scripting for months. The public humiliation wasn't a defeat. It was a gift. It established Ryan's character for all to see. It made him the villain in a narrative they were about to control. No one could now accuse Ava of being a bitter, greedy wife. She was the wronged woman, the pregnant mother-to-be publicly shamed by her powerful husband. The sympathy of their entire social and business world would now be hers. As Ava stepped out of the taxi and into the private elevator that opened directly into their penthouse, her phone vibrated. It was a text from Cassie. "Showtime." Ava stood for a moment in the marble-floored foyer, the silence a stark contrast to the storm that had just broken. She took a deep breath, the filtered air no longer feeling oppressive, but charged with potential. She looked at the city lights, no longer a cage, but a battlefield she was ready to command. She typed her reply, her fingers steady. Showtime. The next morning, Chelsea's art district was bathed in the crisp, bright light of a perfect autumn day. Isabella Thorne was holding court in her eponymous gallery. Gallery Thorne was a monument to her ambition. All polished concrete floors, soaring white walls and track lighting that made the avant-garde sculptures and massive abstract canvases look like sacred relics. The gallery had been open for 2 weeks, and it was the talk of the town funded. It was whispered by a mysterious and very wealthy patron. Isabella felt a thrill of victory. Last night had been perfect. Ava's pathetic, dignified exit had sealed it. Ryan had called her the moment he'd gotten into his own car, fuming about Ava's melodramatic stunt. But his anger had been underscored with something else, a frantic energy that Isabella recognized as the prelude to a break. He was finally seeing Ava as the liability she was, and Isabella as the partner he needed. He was coming over to her apartment later. The war was over, and she had won. She was discussing the placement of a particularly jarring metal sculpture with her gallery director when the front door chimed. A man in a nondescript suit carrying a plain leather briefcase walked in. He didn't look like a collector. He looked like a functionary, a cog in a machine. "Can I help you?" the gallery director asked, her voice oozing practiced snobbery. The man ignored her and walked directly toward Isabella. "Isabella Thorne?" he asked, his voice flat and impersonal. "I am," she said, tilting her head, an eyebrow raised. She assumed he was a vendor, or perhaps an artist hoping to have his work shown. The man opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents. "You've been served," he said. His voice loud enough for the handful of wealthy patrons browse the art to hear. He thrust the documents into her hands. Isabella stared at him, then at the papers. Her mind, still savouring the triumph of the night before, struggled to catch up. Served. What is this? I think you have the wrong person. No mistake, ma'am, the process server said, already turning to leave. Have a nice day. Heads were now turned in her direction. The patrons were whispering their phones, suddenly emerging from their pockets. Isabella's face, which had been a mask of smug satisfaction moments before, was now pale with confusion and dawning horror. She looked down at the top page. It was a legal document stamped with the seal of the Supreme Court of the state of New York. The caption was what made her blood freeze. AVA Reyes, Cole Plaintiff, The Thorne Galleries. LLC and Isabella Thorne, an individual defendants. This wasn't a divorce filing. This wasn't a personal lawsuit for alienation of affection. This was something far more sophisticated, far more dangerous. Her hands trembling, she flipped through the pages. It was a petition for a temporary restraining order and a preliminary injunction to freeze all assets of Thorne Galleries, LLC. The legal language was dense and suffocating, but the accusations were brutally clear. The petition alleged that Thorne Galleries, LLC was not a legitimate independent business, but a shell corporation established for the sole purpose of laundering marital assets out of the Cole family trust. It accused Isabella Thorne of conspiracy to commit fraud and tortious interference with marital property. It was all there, laid out with surgical precision. The date of the LLC's formation, the wire transfer of $350,000 from the trust to the LLC's bank account. Subsequent transfers totaling over $2 million, meticulously detailed with dates and amounts. It even included copies of the wire confirmations, which Ava must have somehow obtained. The petition went further. It included an affidavit from a respected forensic art appraiser who attested that the initial inventory of the gallery, the very paintings hanging on her walls, had been purchased not by the LLC, but by a personal credit card in Ryan Cole's name, and were therefore also considered marital property. It was a masterstroke of legal violence. The lawsuit wasn't about emotion. It was about money. It wasn't aimed at her as a mistress. It was aimed at her as a criminal co-conspirator. The temporary restraining order, if granted, would mean she couldn't sell a single piece of art. She couldn't pay her staff. She couldn't pay the rent on her absurdly expensive gallery space. Her entire business, her entire identity, her entire victory would be frozen in ice. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was Ryan. She ignored it. Her world was tilting on its axis. The whispers of the patrons grew louder. One of them, a prominent collector she had been trying to woo for weeks, gave her a look of utter disdain and walked out of the gallery. Isabella stumbled back, the papers shaking in her hand, and sank into a ridiculously uncomfortable minimalist bench. The cold, smug triumph of the past 12 hours evaporated, replaced by the icy grip of pure panic. She looked around at her beautiful gallery, her kingdom. It no longer felt like a trophy. It felt like a trap. And she was the one who had just been served. The first shot had been fired, not at the king, but at his queen-in-waiting, and it was a direct hit. The explosion came as Ava had known it would, at 2:17 p.m. The private elevator doors hissed open with a violent swoosh, and Ryan stormed into the penthouse. His face was a thundercloud, his perfectly tailored suit rumpled as if he'd been tearing at it. He brandished his phone like a weapon. "What the hell is this, Ava?" he roared, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. "What in the goddamn hell did you do?" Ava was sitting calmly on one of the white sofas, reading a book on infant sleep training. She had dressed for this confrontation deliberately, a simple cashmere sweater and comfortable maternity leggings. She looked soft domestic and completely unbothered. She slowly placed a bookmark in her book, set it down, and looked up at him. The timid, accommodating woman he had humiliated last night was gone. In her place was a stranger, with eyes as calm and cold as a glacier. "I assume you're referring to the lawsuit," she said, her voice even. "You should really be more specific, Ryan. You have so many fires burning, it's hard to keep track." His jaw worked, a vein throbbing in his temple. "Don't play games with me. You sued Isabella. You're trying to ruin her. After what you pulled last night, you have the audacity to do this." "What I pulled?" Ava's laugh was a short, sharp, humorless sound. "You mean when I quietly excused myself after you publicly shamed me and tried to dictate my diet in front of your potential business partners? That stunt? Or do you mean the stunt where you've been funneling millions of dollars of our money, my money, our child's money, into your girlfriend's vanity project?" Ryan was momentarily speechless. He was used to her tears, her quiet hurt. He had no defense against this cold fury, this woman who was meeting his rage with icy facts. "That is my money," he finally sputtered, pointing a finger at her. "I earned it. You earned it while we were married, which makes it marital property." Ava recited, her voice sounding like a lawyer's. "A concept you should be intimately familiar with, since you were the one who insisted on that 100-page prenup. The one that protects me from your debts and protects our shared assets from foolish ventures. Like, for instance, setting up a Mistress in a multi-million-dollar gallery in Chelsea." He stared at her, his mind reeling. This wasn't the Ava he knew. This wasn't the art history major who was content to plan dinner parties. This woman knew the terms of their prenup. This woman knew about the LLC The Wire transfers. "How?" He started, his voice dropping from a roar to a bewildered whisper. "How did you know? You really are that arrogant, aren't you?" Ava stood up slowly, her pregnant form giving her a strange, new authority. "You thought I was just a pretty face to stand by your side. You thought I was too stupid to read a financial statement. You thought I wouldn't notice you were stealing from our family to build a new life with that creature." He recoiled, as if struck. "You leave Isabella out of this." "I can't," Ava said with a shrug. "She's a co-conspirator in your fraud." "That's what this is, Ryan. Fraud. A deliberate, calculated attempt to defraud me of my legal share of the marital estate. And I imagine the IRS and the SEC might be very interested to learn about the web of offshore accounts you used to move the money around. It's amazing what you can find when you know where to look." That was the kill shot, the mention of the SEC. Ryan's entire empire, Coal Capital, was built on a carefully constructed image of legitimacy and untouchable success. An SEC investigation, even a hint of one, could shatter client confidence and trigger a catastrophic collapse. The affair was a scandal. Financial fraud was a death sentence. The rage drained from his face, replaced by a pasty, sickly white. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had inverted. He was no longer the master of the universe, berating his foolish wife. He was a cornered animal, and she was the hunter who had patiently laid the trap. "What do you want, Ava?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The question was a surrender. Want Ava walked over to the window, looking down at the city below. A few months ago, I would have said I wanted my husband back. I wanted my marriage. I wanted the man I fell in love with to look at me the way he used to. She turned back to him, her eyes devoid of any lingering affection. Now I want what's mine. I want a divorce. I want this penthouse. I want the house in the Hamptons. I want full sole custody of our child. I want child support and alimony payments so significant that they will ensure you never forget what you did. And I want the assets in the Cole family trust, all of them put into a new separate trust administered by me for the sole benefit of our baby. She let the demands hang in the air, each one a hammer blow against his crumbling ego. And as for Isabella, Ava continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper, I want her ruined. I want her gallery dismantled. I want her name to be a punchline in every society column. I want her to understand what happens when you try to build your future on the ruins of another woman's family. Ryan sank onto the sofa Ava had just vacated, his head in his hands. He was a man who solved problems with money and power, but for the first time in his life, he was facing a problem that his money and power had created, and which now threatened to consume him entirely. You can't do this, he mumbled, defeated. Ava gave him a final, dismissive look. I can, and I will. You should call your lawyer, Ryan. You're going to need him. My lawyer, she added with a thin, sharp smile, is already on the clock. She turned and walked towards the master bedroom suite, leaving him alone in the vast, silent living room. The king had been checkmated in his own castle. The fallout had just begun, and it was clear that Ava Cole was prepared to burn his entire kingdom to the ground to protect her own. In the rarefied world of Manhattan's elite scandal, travels faster than light. The news of the lawsuit against Gallery Thorne wasn't just a piece of gossip. It was a bombshell that detonated in the pages of the New York Post's Page 6 and was dissected in gleeful detail by society bloggers. The story was irresistible, the pregnant, scorned wife of a Wall Street titan taking spectacular surgical revenge on his mistress. And Ava, guided by Cassie's shrewd advice, played her part to perfection. She was photographed leaving her obstetrician's office on Park Avenue, looking pale but resolute, a protective hand on her belly. She gave no comment, which was more powerful than any statement. Her silence allowed the world to project its own narrative onto her. She was the dignified victim, a modern-day Madonna fighting for her unborn child against the depraved forces of greed and infidelity. For Ryan, the unraveling was swift and brutal. The first tremor hit at Cole Capital. His partner's men, who were just as ruthless as he was, called an emergency board meeting. They weren't concerned about his marriage. They were concerned about the mention of the SEC. What the hell is this, Ryan asked Michael Corrigan, the firm's grizzled co-founder, throwing a copy of the Post onto the polished boardroom table. Web of offshore accounts. Conspiracy to commit fraud. Is there any truth to this? Is your wife about to bring federal investigators to our door? It's a domestic dispute, Michael Ryan snarled, trying to project an aura of control he no longer felt. My wife is being emotional, hysterical even. It's a baseless accusation designed to hurt me. Is it another partner, a younger, hungrier man, named David Chen, chimed in? Because my contact at Morgan Stanley called me this morning. The word on the street is that you're toxic, that your judgment is compromised. The Van Houtens have already pulled their $700 million fund. They cited a loss of confidence in senior management's personal and professional integrity. Ryan felt the blood drain from his face. The loss of the Van Houten Fund wasn't just a financial blow. It was a catastrophic vote of no confidence from old money, a sign to the rest of the market that coal capital was in trouble. His phone, which had once been a tool of power, was now a source of constant dread. Calls from worried clients went unanswered. His attempts to reach influential friends were met with polite but firm rejections from their assistants. He was being socially and professionally quarantined. The friends who had laughed at his jokes at Ethelgard were now distancing themselves, lest the stink of his scandal attach to them. He tried to fight back. He hired a notoriously aggressive divorce attorney, a man named Leonard Singer, who specialized in scorched earth tactics. Singer's first move was to leak a story suggesting Ava was mentally unstable, her actions driven by pregnancy hormones. It backfired spectacularly. Cassie was ready. She released a single devastating counterpunch, a sworn affidavit from Ava's obstetrician, stating that Mrs. Cole was in perfect physical and mental health, but was under extreme emotional distress due to circumstances of spousal misconduct and financial malfeasance. The doctor even noted that stress of this nature could pose a risk to the pregnancy, a detail that painted Ryan not just as an adulterer, but as a man actively endangering his own unborn child. The public sympathy for Ava surged. Meanwhile, Isabella's world had completely collapsed. The court had granted Ava's motion for a temporary restraining order. A court-appointed receiver now controlled her gallery. The doors were locked, a legal notice plastered on the glass. Her name was mud. The art world, which thrives on reputation, shunned her completely. Artists demanded their works back. The few clients she had secured were now suing her for the return of their deposits. Desperate, she bombarded Ryan with calls and texts. "You have to fix this. My life is ruined. You promised me a future." Ryan, besieged from all sides, saw her not as a partner, but as another liability. A loud, panicked anchor pulling him down. "Lie low," he texted back, his words cold and dismissive. "Don't talk to anyone. Let my lawyer handle it." But Isabella was beginning to understand a terrifying truth. Ryan's lawyer wasn't there to protect her. He was there to protect Ryan. She was a loose end to be managed and, if necessary, to be cut. The glamorous dream of being Mrs. Ryan Cole had dissolved into a nightmare of legal fees, public disgrace, and total abandonment. She was alone, trapped in the wreckage of the life he had promised her. The unraveling was also happening on a more personal level. Ava, as part of the initial legal filing, had secured an ex parte order, granting her temporary exclusive occupancy of the penthouse. One afternoon, Ryan arrived to find the locks changed. A stoic doorman handed him a box containing a few of his personal effects: a toothbrush, a razor, a couple of changes of clothes, along with a note from Cassie's office informing him that any further attempts to enter the residence would be considered a breach of the court order, and he would be arrested. He stood on the pavement on Central Park West, holding the pathetic little box, looking up at the glittering tower where his wife, his pregnant, formidable, vengeful wife, was now enthroned. He had lost his home, his biggest client, the respect of his peers and control of the narrative. The world he had built, with such ruthless precision, was cracking and crumbling around him, all because he had made the fatal, arrogant mistake of underestimating the woman he had once promised to love and cherish. The war was far from over, but he was losing on every front. The first preliminary hearing was held in a sterile, impersonal courtroom that felt a world away from the opulence of Ryan's life. It was not open to the press, but the stakes were astronomical. Ava was there, flanked by Cassie Reyes, her demeanor calm and composed. She wore a simple navy blue maternity dress, the picture of quiet strength. Ryan sat at the opposing table with his lawyer Leonard Singer, looking haggard and drawn. The hearing was for the judge to decide whether to issue a preliminary injunction, which would keep Gallery Thorne's assets frozen for the duration of the case. Singer argued passionately that the lawsuit was a frivolous, vindictive action by a scorned wife. "Your Honor, this is a classic case of a marital dispute spilling over into a meritless commercial lawsuit." Singer boomed, his voice filling the room. "Mrs. Cole is using this court to harass Ms. Thorne as a proxy for her anger at my client." Cassie stood up, her presence sharp and focused. "Your Honor, with all due respect to Mr. Singer's flair for drama, this is not a marital dispute. This is a fraud case. We have wire transfers. We have credit card statements. We have a clear and undeniable pattern of Mr. Cole deliberately and illegally diverting marital assets to this entity, Thorne Galleries. The only thing frivolous here is the defense's attempt to paint my client as hysterical. The only thing vindictive is Mr. Cole's systematic attempt to financially gut the estate his own child is set to inherit." Cassie presented her evidence with chilling efficiency. The documents were irrefutable. The judge, a no-nonsense older woman named Esther Ruiz, looked over the papers with a deepening frown. She looked at Ryan, then at Ava's pregnant form. "Mr. Cole, Judge Ruiz," said her voice laced with ice. "It is the opinion of this court that the plaintiff has provided substantial evidence to suggest a high likelihood of success on the merits. The preliminary injunction is granted. The assets of Thorne Galleries, LLC, will remain frozen. Furthermore, I am issuing a broader asset freeze on all non-payroll expenditures from Cole Capital's operational accounts until a full forensic accounting of the marital estate can be completed. I'm not going to have the defendant draining his company to hide money from his wife and child." It was a stunning defeat for Ryan. The judge hadn't just sided with Ava. She had put a financial chokehold on his entire company. Singer was left sputtering while Ryan looked as if he'd been physically struck. But the real twist was happening outside the courtroom. Isabella Thorne had been sitting on a bench in the hallway, summoned by Ryan's lawyer, but largely ignored. She had listened to the proceedings through the heavy wooden doors, hearing herself described as a home-wrecker and a criminal. She heard Ryan's lawyer throw her under the bus, painting her as a naive party to Ryan's actions, at best a manipulative seductress at worst. She had tried to speak to Ryan as he entered the court, but he had walked past her as if she were a ghost. The last of her denial shattered. Ryan was not going to save her. He was going to sacrifice her. He would paint her as the mastermind, the one who had seduced him and tricked him into giving her money. He would use his remaining resources to crush her and walk away, bruised but intact, leaving her to face the legal and financial ruin alone. As Ava and Cassie emerged from the courtroom, their faces grim but victorious, Isabella stood up. Her hands were trembling, her face pale, but her eyes held a desperate, fiery resolve. "Mrs. Cole," she said, her voice shaky but clear. "Ava, can I speak with your lawyer?" Ava stopped, surprised. Cassie put a protective hand on her arm, her expression wary. "Miss Thorne, I don't think we have anything to discuss." "Please," Isabella begged, her voice cracking. The arrogance was gone, replaced by raw fear. "He's going to destroy me. He's going to say this was all my idea. You think you have evidence. You have no idea what I have. I have everything. Text messages, emails, voice notes. He was bragging about it. He told me step by step how he was hiding the money from you. He called it the idiot wife insurance policy. The words hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Ava flinched, the cruelty of the phrase a fresh wound. Cassie's eyes, however, lit up with a predatory gleam, a cooperating witness from inside the enemy camp. This was a gift from the litigation gods. He told me he was going to leave you after the baby was born. Isabella continued, tears now streaming down her face. He said he was just waiting for the asset to be delivered. He's a monster. I was a fool and he's a monster. I don't want to win. I just don't want to be the only one who loses. I'll testify. I'll give you everything. Just make him pay. Cassie looked at Ava, who gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. The enemy of her enemy was for now her friend. An alliance born of mutual betrayal was being forged in the cold, sterile hallway of the New York Supreme Court. Cassie turned back to Isabella, her professional demeanor snapping back into place. "Ms. Thorne," she said, her voice crisp, "my client and I are going for coffee. Perhaps you'd like to join us?" It was the most unexpected twist of all. The two women who had been positioned as mortal enemies, the wife and the mistress, were walking away together, united by the betrayals of one man. Ryan Cole thought he was playing a game of chess, sacrificing a pawn to protect his king. He had no idea that the pawn was about to flip the board over and join forces with the opposing queen. The final confrontation did not take place in a courtroom. There would be no dramatic trial, no public spectacle. Ryan's empire was already so fragile that the mere threat of what Isabella and Ava now held was enough to bring him to his knees. The voice notes in which Ryan callously detailed his schemes to defraud Ava and referred to his unborn child as an asset were the nuclear option. If those were made public, he wouldn't just lose his business. He could face criminal charges and would be irrevocably disgraced in the eyes of everyone, including the most amoral Wall Street shark. The meeting was held in Cassie Reyes's office, a sleek, modern space with a panoramic view of the Hudson River. It was neutral territory, but it felt like Ava's ground. She sat at the head of the massive conference table, Cassie by her side. Isabella was not present. Her sworn deposition and the trove of evidence she had provided were enough. Ryan and his lawyer, Leonard Singer, sat opposite them. The fight had gone out of Ryan. The past few weeks had hollowed him out. He looked older, smaller, his expensive suit hanging loosely on his diminished frame. "All right, Cassie." Singer began trying to inject some of his usual bluster into the proceedings, but it sounded hollow. "We're here to talk settlement. Let's hear your terms." Cassie didn't speak. She looked at Ava, deferring to her. This was Ava's moment. Ava slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was not a long, complicated legal document. It was a term sheet, simple, brutal, and absolute. "This is not a negotiation," Ryan Ava said, her voice as steady and unyielding as the bedrock of the city itself. "This is what you will agree to, or Ms. Thorne's evidence becomes the property of the district attorney and the New York Times." Ryan picked up the paper, his hand trembling slight. Terms of dissolution. 1. Custody. Ava Reyes. Cole is to have sole legal and physical custody of the child. Ryan Cole will have supervised visitation rights twice a month at Ava's discretion. 2. Property. The Fifth Avenue penthouse and the Hamptons estate are to be signed over to Ava free and clear of all liens. 3. The Cole Family Trust. The entire contents of the trust are to be moved into a new irrevocable trust for the child with Ava as the sole trustee. Ryan will have no access and no oversight. 4. Alimony and child support. A lump sum payment of $50 million to be paid to Ava. Child support will be set at the statutory maximum under New York state law. 5. Business. Ryan will personally buy out Ava's 50% stake in his remaining personal assets and ventures valued at market rate by a court-appointed appraiser. 6. Mutual non-disclosure and non-disparagement. Both parties agree not to speak publicly about the other. However, this clause is rendered null and void for Ava if any part of this agreement is breached by Ryan. Singer read the terms and let out a low whistle. This is insane. This is punitive. This will gut him. That is the point, Cassie said flatly. This is the price of his actions. He tried to leave my client with nothing. He's lucky she's leaving him with his company, though I doubt it will be worth much by the time the market is done with him. Ryan stared at the paper, then looked across the table at Ava. He searched her face for any flicker of the woman he had married, any sign of softness or doubt. He found none. He was looking at a stranger, a woman forged in the fire of his own making. Ava. Please, he whispered the last pathetic plea of a dethroned king. There is nothing left to say. Ryan, she replied, her voice devoid of hatred or anger. It was worse. It was indifferent. You did this. You mocked me when I was at my most vulnerable. You tried to steal our child's future for a woman you abandoned the second she became inconvenient. You called your own baby an asset. This isn't punishment. It's an accounting. It's the bill for your choices. She stood up, her pregnancy prominent, a symbol of the future he had forfeited. Sign the papers, Ryan. It's the last decision you'll get to make in our life together. With that, she and Cassie walked out of the conference room, leaving Ryan to stare at the document that codified his utter and complete defeat. 6 months later, Ava stood in the nursery of the Fifth Avenue penthouse. It was a beautiful light-filled room, decorated in soft yellows and grays. In her arms, she held her daughter, a perfect, healthy baby named Hope. The city sprawled out below them, no longer a prison or a battlefield, but simply a view. Her view. The news had reported that Ryan Cole had stepped down as CEO of his firm amidst a massive client exodus and was selling his stake at a fraction of its former value. Gallery Thorne had been liquidated, its assets sold to partially satisfy the settlement. Isabella Thorne had disappeared, rumored to have moved back to the Midwest, her New York ambitions shattered. Ava looked down at her daughter's sleeping face and felt a profound sense of peace. The storm was over. She had walked through fire not just for herself, but for the tiny, innocent life in her arms. She hadn't just survived. She had triumphed. She was not Ryan Cole's discarded wife. She was Ava Cole, a mother, a protector, and the architect of her own and her daughter's unbreakable future. Ava's story is a powerful reminder that the deepest betrayals can often ignite the fiercest strength. She was publicly humiliated, underestimated, and left for ruin by the one person who should have protected her. But instead of breaking, she meticulously built a case, turned the tables on her tormentors, and reclaimed not just her fortune, but her power and her future for herself and her child. This wasn't just a story about a messy divorce. It was a masterclass in strategy resilience and the quiet, unshakable power of a woman who has been pushed too far. She proved that the best revenge isn't living well, it's winning. If you were inspired by Ava's incredible journey from humiliation to triumph, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more true-life stories of justice and empowerment. Let us know in the comments what you think about Ava's ultimate checkmate move.